a budget published 35 minutes before it was presented, an opposition leader ripping strips off the PM, and the BBC analysis of key points before the Chancellor even presents. This is probably the most dramatic budget day I've ever seen. I'm Claire Bailey and this is Retail Reckoning, and it had been my plan to assess the budget from a consumer-facing and consumer point of view. But let me explain first what's just happened, because quite honestly, it was like watching a real-life Netflix drama unfold, and then I'll dive into the detail itself.
Yeah, retail reckoning, no space for dusty shelves, 'cause retail reckoning owns the floor.
So, the OBR, Office of Budgetary Responsibility, report was published around 11:55. And I'd got the panel on BBC Two Politics just in the background on mute while I was doing some work. But then I saw what was cracking up and I was like, oh my goodness me. They were able to grab and download the report, which is now in full view on the Telegraph's website, and start reading out passages live. And then it turned out that Kemi, the opposition leader, she had it as well. And she totally took the pee out of the government for the chaos around all of this.
It's a total humiliation, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last year, she put up taxes by £40 billion, the biggest tax rate in British history. She promised that she wouldn't be back for more. She swore it was a one-off. She told everyone that from now on, it would be stability and she would pay for everything with growth. Today, she has broken every single one of those promises. If she had any decency, she would resign.
Of course, she's aware of the document's early publishing, and as I was watching it, I was just astonished that it had been allowed to happen. The BBC cut away from PMQs, where obviously Kemi was ripping a strip off Starmer, and they went back to the panel on BBC Politics, who'd had about 20 minutes to skim read the 203 pages that were in the budget analysis. And they were in analysis mode before it was even presented. I mean, quite frankly, I think Kemi could have been a lot more full-on with Starmer over this. The panel on BBC Two were using words like unprecedented and extraordinary. And it is. It was drama in real life. I mean, they were disclosing things like the cap on child maintenance being lifted, the mansion tax, and the NI on salary sacrifice pension contributions, all before it was ever officially presented. Anyway, setting aside the relative madness of today, I've actually planned to look at this in a more moderate, if that's even possible, way and consider the core parts that affect consumer-facing businesses, so retail, hospitality, leisure, personal care, visitor economy, and large and small, and also those who spend with them, so the consumer themselves. So I'll probably need to draw a breath, recover from this remarkable episode, and crack on with what I'd planned to chat about today. So the first thing disclosed this morning ahead of the actual budget presentation were the minimum wage rises. Yet again, it's an impact on the cost of employment. And quite frankly, it already happened when it came out of last year's budget. Impact of cost of employment simply leads to things like reduced hours being offered or prices having to rise to swallow the cost of serving staff or staff on the tills and whatnot. That kind of negates the value of minimum wage because people working on minimum wage often work in retail, hospitality, leisure type jobs anyway. So if they get less hours, they've got less spending power. Alternatively, their wages may have gone up, but if prices go up to absorb the cost of the wages going up, then their spending power is actually not changed. Sort of seems like all it's doing is driving inflation or putting people under greater pressure. It also seems to be pushing some businesses to consider actually closing either completely due to the cost of overheads overall making trade non-viable and also the ongoing low confidence in the consumer economy, or closed partially. If minimum and living wage are going up on top of the 2024 rises in national insurance and so on, that has already really negatively impacted the ability of even small businesses to cover staff costs, even those who aren't impacted by the NI. The bigger companies were definitely impacted by both. Despite the fact they believe people will spend surplus income in the local economy, I worry that there'll be any surplus if prices go up to absorb the cost of staffing or if hours are cut. Now, also this morning, we heard about sugar tax. that's price rises on milk products as a result of being classified within the sugar tax. I can imagine this is going to impact on places like cafes. And actually, there's been a growing trend to dessert-centric shops and milkshake-type shops who offer tweens and teens a place to go that's quite sociable, quite youth-centric, and offers that environment that's kid-friendly. And I kind of imagine it replicates the pub for an underage. So yeah, milk tax, sugar tax, that just seems a little obscure, but we'll see how that one pans out. Then this morning as well, there was a debate going on in Bradford with BBC Breakfast as a bit of an outside broadcast. They were chatting to all sorts of people, but in particular, Kate Nichols from UK Hospitality was on and talking about the impact on business owners in hospitality, and there was also a venue company there. In the past year, they were declaring, they'd had lower footfall, fewer customers spending as much. And their business was live music venues that had helped grassroots music providers to reach an audience and perhaps become the next big thing. Now, that company had to become a CIC, a community interest company, and they got everybody working as volunteers just to keep going. And the topics that were raised and keep being raised were reduced business rates, reduced VAT for hospitality, and so on. Yeah, we've heard about that, and business rates come up in a bit. The other thing we've seen is that the mayors are going to have the option to impose tourist tax. Now, a lot of the hospitality owners, and again, there was one speaking on Breakfast this morning, think that that's going to hinder occupancy because it puts up costs for UK families who want to stay in UK-based accommodation. It's already quite expensive to be in the UK. The cost of eating out and everything else compared to going abroad, even factoring in flights and accommodation. Will people even want to travel in the UK? Or are they going to increase their propensity to go overseas at a lower cost? And for more reliable weather, let's face it. The other thing they said was that to manage the necessary reduction in staff, they deployed technology like self-check-ins and so on. But then you have to admit that does reduce service. And if you've got a question and there's just literally no one there to ask, what do you do? So again, it's a deterrent to people wanting to go to places where they aren't staff visibly present. And also there's a safety risk there. What if you're a single mum travelling with 2 young kids and you go to a place and there's only self-check-in and a few security cameras? Would you genuinely feel comfortable there versus somewhere which was more vibrant and people around? And, you didn't just feel so remote. Hospitality are also calling for some kind of rates in terms of VAT or VAT relief so that they can pass the reduction in cost on to consumers. And that will enable pubs to hopefully get more people sat at tables having a meal or a drink and hotels to get sufficient occupancy to remain viable. I mean, some of the businesses this morning were saying they have debts to their energy suppliers and they've got signs up to tell their customers to switch off the lights and so on. I mean, that sounds almost like post-war level. And during times in the 70s when there was the rationing of energy and so on. What we can see is fundamentally the last budget has already hurt. And now with the minimum wage increases that are coming on hard and fast again, the consumer confidence where particularly those who perhaps had a reasonable disposable income are now worrying about some of the changes to things like savings, pensions, tax on pensions, and so on. Business rates impacting, employment tax, VAT. I think that it's going to create a certain element of nervousness until the dust settles. Obviously, we won't see how this percolates through for a while yet. I'm doing this literally minutes after Rachel Reeves has finished her presentation. One of the things that UK Hospitality did say was that hospitality was disproportionately hit in the last budget, and the impact has been, which is something I predicted, I'm not going to lie, to lose staff. Prices are only able to go up as far as consumers are willing to pay, and with consumer confidence being low, they can't really put the prices up. So many locations are actually reducing their opening hours. But that's a double-edged sword as well. You're paying rent and rates for every hour, 24/7. But of course, just putting the lights on, the heating on, switching on the ventilation or extraction fans and so on means that with low footfall, the cost of just switching on the basic systems to welcome customers might be over and above the profit that they'll make on the minimum sales they'll achieve. So yeah, it's a really knife-edge situation for certainly pubs, restaurants, cafes, bars and so on. But that's also seen in retail. In this budget, as predicted, and I think I wrote a blog and did a podcast on this a little while ago, she has announced support for high streets for smaller businesses and pubs, and thanks to the lobbying by the British Retail Consortium and UK Hospitality. But she's whacking up the rates on the bigger units, the ones with over, I think it was £500,000 business rateable value. And that was anticipated, but they're really large units, generally out of town. And the average one probably has a payroll of several hundred people. She referred to them as the big sheds. Now, I remember the analysis by the British Retail Consortium that said something like 400 of those, and of which there might be 4,000 in the whole of the UK, but 400 of those might become non-viable if the bills go up and might then therefore consider closing. So if they employ 500 or so people, we're talking about thousands of jobs at risk. And that's where they're putting the business rates up to take from the apparently rich, but are they, to give back to the small. Now, obviously the high street needs support and rates for the high street need to be considered, but not at the loss of rates for the bigger companies. And I can certainly see that it's positive for a few, but really worrying for some of the larger employers. There was another comment about half of new jobs are being created by scale-up businesses. So they're going to deploy enterprise incentives to help expand growing companies and to help them with growing their brand and their identity. And that might be something that helps the brands that perhaps sell to retail and consumers and high streets. Or it even might help new and interesting consumer-facing service providers who've come up with a concept and then want to roll it out. But it remains to see how that translates, and there wasn't sufficient detail at this stage to really go into that. Obviously, any enterprise initiative to help businesses grow is fantastic, but we need to see how that translates to the high street. Another really interesting area was that they're devolving significant cash funds to the 7 mayors to invest in skills and employability and so on. And particularly the high streets got a mention there. We hope that this does actually hit the high streets. I'm pretty confident it will in York and North Yorkshire because I met their mayor at the launch of the York Business Festival on Monday evening. Quite interestingly, he has been an independent menswear retailer in the centre of York and traded for 10 years. So at least one of the mayors has some of that local independent small business experience and understands the consumer economy in his heart. But he also made me chuckle because he told Andy Burnham that he was a better mayor than him. There was another comment. There'll be support for costs of training and apprenticeships for SMEs for those employees under 25. In fact, it will be completely free. So it's handy potentially to help small businesses bring in new staff on a lower risk basis. But then again, with the recent changes to minimum wage, it's no longer as cost effective as it was. And if a small business has to dedicate time to on-the-job training, it can end up costing them more in their own lost productivity than it actually generates in the productivity of the apprentice or the learner. Whilst it sounds good, only businesses of a certain size and scale are going to be able to take that opportunity on, because you can't have the owner with perhaps the one part-time assistant manager, one of those tied up looking after an apprentice, when the apprenticeship now costs, or the apprenticeship salary now costs considerably more than it did a couple of years ago. My other final points from watching this live is you've got to love that Deputy Speaker. She actually told off one of the Conservative MPs. She told him to simmer down and stated she expected more of him. And she actually wagged her finger. It was really, really funny. Honestly, it smacked of a schoolmistress telling off an unruly child. But in fairness, I did think that, whether they agree with her or not, they should have allowed her to speak and listen with some respect. I'm not surprised people don't like or trust politicians when they can't behave themselves even in such a serious and significant parliamentary meeting. So anyway, to wrap up, on that note, this has been what we've been presented with now. There'll be loads of analysis over the next few days. Gut feel is it's potentially precarious. There's some good stuff in there potentially, but, we'll have to see how it washes through. And as business owners, small business owners, whether retail, hospitality, leisure, and myself running a small boutique consultancy. We now need to work out how to best navigate what's coming, how to manage things like the balance of staffing costs and all the other overheads and our product costs and so on. Good luck for those who've been keeping their eye on this budget. And as ever, give me a shout if you want to have a rant about it. It's certainly something that's got my heckles up today. This has been Retail Reckoning. I'm Claire Bailey, the Retail Champion. Thank you for listening.
Yeah,